Chapter 1. A chance encounter in the ashes of war. The battle had been over for days, yet the planet still reeked of fire and death. Thorn Walker adjusted the breather mask over his face as he trudged through the ruins of Velrades, once a thriving metropolis on the edge of Coalition space, now reduced to a graveyard of shattered stone and scorched metal. It was supposed to be a salvage job. Thorn wasn't a soldier anymore. He had left those days behind, choosing instead to take up work as a scavenger, picking through the remnants of war-torn worlds for anything that could be sold, repaired, or repurposed. But Velrades was different. The Terrakian Empire had razed this city to the ground, leaving nothing behind but ash, broken corpses, and the ghosts of those who had lived here. No survivors. At least, that was what the official reports had said, until Thorn heard the cry. It was faint, barely audible over the shifting rubble as the wind howled through the ruins. But it was there a sound that didn't belong to the groaning of metal or the hiss of leaking gas lines. It was soft, frightened, weak. It was a child. Thorn's body reacted before his mind could catch up, his boots crunching over broken glass as he moved toward the sound. He didn't think. He just acted. Years of military training and battlefield instincts kicked in, guiding his steps as he navigated through the skeletal remains of what had once been a residential sector. The cry came again, this time closer. Thorn's heart hammered against his ribs. He moved faster, scanning the debris for any sign of movement, and then beneath a partially collapsed support beam, wedged between chunks of duracrete and shattered steel panels, he saw it. A small figure, curled up, trembling. It wasn't human, but it was alive. A child left behind. The little one was Kaelari, one of the many species that had once called Velrades home before the Terrakians had come with fire and blood. She was small, barely the size of a human toddler, her delicate body covered in thin, silken fur that shimmered in the dim light, a deep shade of violet and silver. Two large luminous eyes, the color of molten gold, stared up at him through the grime and dust caking her face. Her clothes were torn and dirty, the once elegant fabric reduced to nothing more than tattered scraps. Thorn knelt, his movements slow, careful. "Hey there, kid," he murmured, his voice rough from the harsh air of the ruined city. "You're all right now." The child flinched at his voice, shrinking back against the rubble, her small hands clutching a shard of metal, her only weapon. Thorn raised both hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Easy. I'm not gonna hurt you." Her golden eyes flickered with uncertainty, scanning him, gauging him. He had seen that look before in war zones, in refugee camps, in the eyes of children who had lost everything. Her small body shivered violently, whether from fear or exhaustion, he wasn't sure. Thorn didn't have much time to earn her trust. He knew that. The ruins were still unstable, and there was no telling if any Terrakian patrols were still scanning the area for survivors. He reached into his pack, pulling out a ration bar and a canteen of purified water. Slowly, he placed them on the ground between them, then leaned back, giving her space. Her nose twitched, catching the scent of food. For a moment, she hesitated, then, with trembling fingers, she snatched the ration bar, clutching it tightly like it might vanish if she let go. Thorn exhaled, relief washing over him. She was hungry. That meant she was still fighting to survive. "That's right, kid," he said softly. "Eat. You'll need your strength." She stared at him again, then at the ration bar, before hesitantly peeling away the wrapper. She nibbled at it, her tiny fangs flashing for a split second before she chewed slowly, her body still rigid with tension. Thorn watched her carefully. She was Kaelari nobility, he realized, based on the intricate markings faintly visible beneath the grime on her skin. A highborn child. A survivor. And if she was still alive, that meant someone might be looking for her. Someone important. Thorn sighed. This was not how he'd planned his day to go. A mother's anguish. Thorn had just finished securing the child in his arms when he heard it, a sound so raw, so filled with pain, that it sent a chill straight through his spine. A wail of grief. It came from somewhere deep in the ruins, a voice full of anguish, rage, and desperation. Thorn's grip tightened around the child instinctively. The little Kaelari girl perked up suddenly, her golden eyes wide, her tiny ears twitching at the sound. She knew that voice. Thorn's heart pounded. This just got a lot more complicated. Without hesitation, he followed the sorrowful cry, his boots crunching over shattered stone as he moved deeper into the ruined city. He knew the risks walking into an unknown situation, carrying a child that someone might kill for, but something about that voice. It didn't belong to a hunter. It belonged to someone who had lost everything. And when Thorn finally found her, he understood. She was Kaelari, like the child in his arms, taller than a human, her silver-blue skin marred with ash and dried blood, her flowing dark hair unkempt, strands clinging to her sweat-slicked face. Her armor was cracked, scorched from battle, but she was still standing, still searching. Her eyes, those same molten gold eyes as the child, snapped to him instantly, widening in pure, visceral shock when she saw who he was holding. For a single breath, the world stood still. Then, the woman let out a choked sob and collapsed to her knees. Her voice broke. "My child?" Thorn felt a lump in his throat as the little one in his arms reached out with trembling fingers. "Mama?" The Kaelari woman shook violently, pressing a trembling hand to her lips as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then, before Thorn could react, she lunged forward, falling at his feet, bowing her head so low that her forehead touched the ground. Thorn froze. The woman spoke in Kaelari, her voice thick with raw emotion. Then she switched to Galactic Common, her words reverent, shaking, unsteady. "You saved my child?" Thorn swallowed. "Yeah." The woman looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, her golden eyes filled with something that made Thorn's breath catch in his throat. Then, in a voice so filled with awe and devotion that it sent a shiver down his spine, she whispered, "Then you are chosen by the gods." And before Thorn could say a single word, she bowed to him in worship. Chapter 2. The Weight of Worship. Thorn Walker had been called many things in his life: mercenary, smuggler, war criminal, scavenger, but never a god. Yet here he was, standing in the ruins of Velrades, holding a Kaelari child in his arms, while her widowed mother knelt before him in worship. It didn't make sense. Thorn swallowed hard, trying to process the situation. The woman, tall, regal despite the blood and soot covering her battle-worn armor, was bowing before him, her forehead pressed to the ground, her shoulders trembling as silent sobs racked her body. Her golden eyes, identical to her daughter's, flickered with an emotion that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. Devotion. She wasn't just grateful. She genuinely believed he was something more. Thorn exhaled, shifting his stance. "Hey, Ladia, you don't have to do that." The woman did not move. Instead, she pressed her hand to her chest, her voice thick with reverence. "You saved her," she whispered. "You saved my child when even the gods turned their backs on us." Thorn's grip on the little Kaelari girl tightened. The child had buried her face against his shoulder, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of his jacket as if she was afraid he might disappear. Thorn wasn't good at this. He was a survivor, not a hero. He wasn't the kind of man who inspired people, who saved innocent lives. He had killed too many times to ever be considered a good person. And yet, this woman, this broken, grieving mother, was looking at him like he was divine. It made his skin crawl. Thorn shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I just did what anyone would have done. You don't have to dash." The woman looked up sharply, cutting him off with a single glance. "No," she said. "Not just anyone would have done this." Her golden eyes burned. "I searched for her," she continued, voice breaking. "I searched through the ruins, through the corpses, through the fires. I called to the gods, I begged them for mercy, and yet, they were silent." She swallowed, her fingers curling into fists against the broken stone beneath her. "But then, you appeared." Thorn tensed. She rose to her feet, slow and deliberate, until she was standing before him, her towering form nearly dwarfing him. "You found her," she murmured. "You carried her from the ashes, as if sent by the heavens themselves." Thorn opened his mouth to argue, to tell her she was wrong, to tell her that he was just a man, nothing more, but the words never came, because the look on her face, she had already made up her mind. To her, it didn't matter who he really was. To her, he was the answer to a desperate prayer. And Thorn didn't know how to handle that. The price of being chosen. The Kaelari woman led him away from the ruins, guiding him through the twisting remnants of what had once been her city. The fires had died down, leaving behind a wasteland of crumbling structures, skeletal spires, and the sickening stench of death. Thorn kept the child close, the little one clinging to him like a lifeline. "She's been silent since I found her," he muttered. Barely spoke a word. The mother, who had finally given her name as Nirali Valrithis, cast a sorrowful glance at her daughter. "Her name is Savara," she whispered. "She was the last heir of my house." Thorn's stomach sank. "You mean?" Nirali nodded. "The rest are dead." Thorn exhaled. "I'm sorry." She did not weep. Not anymore. "I grieved when the bombs fell," she said quietly. "I grieved when I found my husband's body. I grieved when I searched through the rubble and found nothing but ashes." She turned to him, eyes burning. "But when I saw my daughter in your arms, I knew my grief had ended." Thorn hesitated. "Why?" Nirali's expression softened, but the intensity in her gaze never wavered. "Because the gods sent you," she whispered. "Because you brought her back to me." Thorn muttered a curse under his breath. "Lady, I already told you, I'm not some kind of dash." She suddenly reached out, placing a hand over his chest. Thorn froze. "I do not expect you to believe," she murmured, "but I do. And in our culture, when one is chosen by the gods, when one answers the call of destiny." She lifted her chin. "They are bound to those they save." Thorn's heart stopped. "Hold on," he said slowly. "Bound? What does that mean?" Nirali's lips curved into the faintest smile. "It means, human, that you are no longer just a rescuer." She took a step closer, her presence overwhelming, her voice soft but absolute. "You are now our protector." Thorn blinked. What?" Nirali placed a hand over her heart and bowed her head. "You saved my daughter's life," she said. "By Kylari law and tradition, that means you are now our guardian. Our fate is tied to yours." Thorn's pulse spiked. "You're saying I'm responsible for both of you now?" She nodded. "Yes." Thorn let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "That's crazy. You don't even know me." "I know enough," she murmured. Thorn stared at her, his mind racing. He should leave. He should say no. He should tell her that she and her daughter were better off without him. But then Savara tightened her tiny fingers around his jacket, nestling closer into his chest. Thorn exhaled. "Damn it. You're really not giving me a choice, are you?" he muttered. Nirali smiled. "No." Thorn ran a hand through his hair, sighing heavily. "Fine," he grumbled. "I'll get you both somewhere safe." Nirali's eyes softened. "Then the gods have truly blessed us." Thorn groaned. "I am not a god." Nirali chuckled. "To me, it does not matter." Thorn muttered another curse. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. But as he looked down at the small Kylari girl in his arms, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to abandon her. Chapter 3. A Guardian's Burden. Thorn Walker had survived wars, betrayals, and the void of deep space. But he had never been worshipped before. And he definitely had never been responsible for an alien widow and her child. As the wreckage of Velrades faded into the distance, he focused on guiding them toward the edge of the ruins, where he had stashed his modified freighter. The battered city was still smoldering from the Tarakian attack, and even though the invasion force had moved on, Thorn knew they weren't entirely safe yet. His boots crunched against the cracked pavement. The weight of Savara still nestled against his chest. The Kylari child had stopped trembling, but she clung to him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being needed. Behind him, Nirali Valrithis moved with a graceful but deadly silence, her sharp golden eyes scanning the ruins for any potential threats. Thorn could feel the intensity of her presence, could sense the tension in the way she held her damaged weapon close, as if expecting an ambush at any moment. They walked for nearly an hour before the charred remains of a transport station came into view. Thorn exhaled in relief. His ship, the Wayfarer, was hidden beneath the collapsed framework of a destroyed docking bay, its matte black hull blending into the ruined landscape. They were almost safe. But as he took another step forward, Nirali suddenly raised a hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Wait," she whispered. Thorn immediately froze, instincts kicking in. He heard it too. A low, guttural growl. Then movement. From the shadows of the wreckage, Several massive figures emerged, their armor glinting beneath the dim, smoky sky. Terrakian hunters. Thorn muttered a curse under his breath. Of course it wasn't going to be that easy. The Terrakian hunters. Terrakians were a warlike species, towering reptilian bipeds with thick, ridged skulls and 4 arms, their bodies built for brutality and endurance. These weren't standard infantry, though. No, these were hunters, the elite warriors who specialized in tracking down survivors after planetary raids. Thorn recognized their crimson armor, the vicious plasma weapons strapped to their forearms, and the way they moved, slow and deliberate, as if they were already certain of their victory. The largest of the group, a hulking Terrakian with jagged scars running down his chest plate, stepped forward. His slitted eyes gleamed as he looked between Thorn and Nirali, then at the Kylari child in Thorn's arms. A slow, rumbling chuckle escaped him. "You carry highborn prey, human," he growled in heavily accented common. "That is an expensive mistake." Thorn didn't move, his grip tightening around Savara. "I don't suppose you'd accept a bribe to walk away?" he asked. The hunter grinned, revealing rows of serrated teeth. "Your corpse will make fine tribute." Yeah, he'd figured as much. The battle in the ruins. The first shot was fired before Thorn could even react. A blue plasma bolt slammed into the ground near his foot, sending up a spray of molten rock and debris. Thorn dove behind a pile of rubble, shielding Savara with his body as the Terrakians charged forward. Nirali was already moving, her blade flashing in the dim light as she closed the distance between them and the first hunter. She was faster than Thorn had expected. She ducked beneath a swiping claw, twisting as she drove her weapon deep into the soft flesh beneath the hunter's jaw. The creature gurgled, its body convulsing violently before collapsing. But there were still 2 more. Thorn pulled his blaster, firing off 3 quick shots toward the second hunter, but the Terrakian's armor absorbed most of the impact. The hunter lunged, swinging a plasma-tipped blade straight for Thorn's head. He barely had time to dodge, rolling out of the way at the last second. Savara let out a startled whimper, her tiny fingers clutching at his jacket. Thorn gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip. He couldn't keep dodging forever, not while carrying the kid. He needed an opening, and Nirali gave him one. The Kylari warrior twisted mid-air, launching herself at the second hunter, her movements fluid, ruthless. She was a storm of motion, using her opponent's sheer size against them, dodging their heavy swings before plunging her blade between their armor plates. The hunter roared in agony, but she wasn't done. With a feral snarl, she twisted the weapon, severing a major artery before ripping it free. The Terrakian fell, blood pooling beneath its twitching body. That left 1 more. The final hunter hesitated, his slitted eyes flicking between Nirali and Thorn, assessing his odds. Then he turned and fled. Thorn let out a heavy breath, rolling his shoulders. "Yeah, you better run." But Nirali wasn't finished. She raised her plasma pistol, took precise aim, and fired. The fleeing hunter dropped instantly, a smoking hole between his shoulders. Thorn arched a brow. "You really don't leave loose ends, do you?" Nirali turned to him, breathing heavily, her golden eyes flashing. "No," she said simply. Thorn couldn't tell if he was impressed or terrified. Maybe a little of both. An uneasy future. With the Terrakian hunters dead, they finally reached the Wayfarer. The ship's engines hummed softly as Thorn went through the pre-flight checks, making sure they weren't leaking fuel or missing critical components. Savara had finally dozed off, curled up in one of the seats, exhaustion overtaking her tiny body. Nirali sat across from Thorn in the cockpit, watching him in silence. "You fought well," she said after a long pause. Thorn glanced at her. "You weren't so bad yourself." A flicker of amusement crossed her face, but it vanished just as quickly. Then, in a voice carefully measured, she said, "You still do not believe." Thorn sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm not a god. I'm just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time." Nirali tilted her head, studying him. "Perhaps," she murmured, "or perhaps the gods chose you for a reason." Thorn exhaled. "And what if I don't want to be chosen?" Nirali's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then why did you stay?" Thorn didn't have an answer. As the Wayfarer lifted off, leaving the ruins of Velrades behind, he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. Chapter 4. A destiny denied, a fate embraced. The Wayfarer hummed softly as it drifted through the black abyss of space, the ruined world of Velrotes shrinking behind them. Thorn Walker had spent his entire life running from wars, from debts, from his own damn mistakes. But this time, for the first time in years, he had no idea where to go. Sitting in the cockpit, he stared at the holomap of nearby systems, debating their next move. Behind him, Nirali Valrithis sat with quiet patience, her golden eyes fixed on him, watching as if she could see the war waging inside his head. Between them, in one of the cushioned seats, Savara lay curled up, deep in exhausted sleep, her tiny body rising and falling with each soft breath. Thorn exhaled heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered. "We need to figure out where the hell we're going." Nirali's gaze didn't waver. "Home," she said simply. Thorn scoffed. "Lady, I hate to break it to you, but your home's a smoking crater." Nirali didn't blink. "Not Velrotes," she murmured. "Kyler Prime." Thorn froze. His stomach twisted. "Kyler Prime," he repeated. "You mean the Kyleri homeworld? The one controlled by noble houses that probably want me dead?" "Yes." Thorn gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, no. That's not happening." Nirali tilted her head slightly, as if she had already expected his answer. "Why?" Thorn gestured wildly at himself. "Because I am not Kyleri. I am not one of you. And the last thing I need is to land on some aristocratic planet filled with knife-eared aliens who want my head because of some cosmic misunderstanding." Nirali smiled slightly, unshaken. "You are not Kyleri," she agreed, "but you are ours." Thorn groaned. "Gods, not this again." Nirali leaned forward, her golden eyes shining with conviction. "You are bound to us, Thorn Walker," she said. "You are Savara's savior. You are my daughter's guardian. That makes you Kyleri in all but blood." Thorn ran a hand down his face. He hated how she said it, hated how right it sounded, despite everything in his soul screaming otherwise. "You really believe that, don't you?" he muttered. Nirali nodded. "Yes." He exhaled. "Why?" She watched him carefully, as if choosing her next words very deliberately. Then, in a voice softer than before, she said, "Because my daughter no longer cries when she sleeps." Thorn's breath hitched. Nirali's gaze flickered toward Savara, her expression unreadable but warm. "She held on to her grief," Nirali murmured. "Even when I tried to comfort her, even when I told her I was still here, she did not speak. She did not eat. She did not look at me." She turned her eyes back to Thorn. "But when she is with you," she whispered, "she feels safe." Thorn swallowed. He glanced at Savara, at the way her tiny hands clutched the fabric of his jacket even in sleep, like she feared he would leave her behind. A weight settled in his chest. He had never asked for this, but here it was. A responsibility. A life tethered to his own. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run from it. Thorn exhaled sharply, leaning back in his seat. "Damn it." Nirali raised an eyebrow. "Does this mean you accept?" Thorn grumbled something under his breath. "I'll take you to Kyler Prime," he muttered, "but only to make sure you two are safe." Nirali smiled gently. "Of course." Thorn narrowed his eyes. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Nirali didn't confirm or deny, but her soft laughter was answer enough. Kyler Prime, walking into the lion's den. When the Wayfarer entered Kyler Prime's orbit, Thorn was already regretting everything. The planet's vast cityscapes stretched across the surface like a work of artistic perfection, gleaming silver spires piercing the violet sky, sprawling districts lined with ancient architecture and impossibly advanced technology. It was beautiful. It was also dangerous as hell. Nirali's people weren't just warriors, they were politicians, and nothing was more terrifying than an aristocrat with a vendetta. As they descended toward one of the private noble docking stations, Thorn felt a knot tighten in his gut. This was a mistake. A huge mistake. But when the docking ramp lowered, and Nirali stepped forward with regal confidence, Savara's small hand clutched in hers, Thorn knew there was no turning back. Waiting for them stood a small delegation of armored Kyleri soldiers alongside a tall, imposing figure draped in royal robes. Lord Valar Valrithis, Nirali's father-in-law, and the head of their noble house. The moment his golden gaze fell upon Thorn, his expression hardened like stone. This is the human? Valer's voice was low, controlled, dangerous. Nirali stood tall. Yes. Valer's eyes narrowed. You would bring an outsider into our bloodline? Nirali's hand tightened around Savaris. He is already bound to us, she said. By action, by honor, by fate. Valer studied Thorn for a long, tense moment. Then to Thorn's complete shock he bowed. You have my gratitude, he said, voice gruff but genuine, for returning my granddaughter. Thorn blinked. Sure. Valer straightened. But do not mistake my gratitude for acceptance. Thorn sighed. Yeah, I figured. Nirali smirked slightly, her expression unreadable. But then, as if sensing his unease, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. Do not fear, she murmured. You will not face this alone. And to his own surprise, Thorn believed her. For the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't just surviving. He wasn't just running. He had something to protect. And for once he didn't want to let go. Epilogue. The beginning of something new. Later that night, as Thorn sat in a private chamber within the Valrethus estate, he found himself staring at his own reflection, wondering how the hell he had gotten here. Behind him, Nirali entered silently, setting down a tray of food and tea. You look troubled, she observed. Thorn scoffed. Yeah, probably because I walked into a city full of people who want me dead. Nirali smirked. Not all of us. He raised an eyebrow. Oh. She tilted her head, watching him. Then, in a voice softer than before, she said, My daughter calls you father in her sleep. Thorn's heart stopped. Nirali's golden eyes held his. Are you going to deny her that? Thorn let out a slow, shaky breath. Then, finally he smiled. No, he said. I'm not. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what came next.